I was 19, sleeping in a rusted Honda Civic, when they handed me a deed to 12 acres of worthless swamp. My own family laughed. They said I'd inherited a mosquito farm. But 3 months later, my machete struck solid marble. The jungle hadn't overgrown a swamp. It had swallowed an empire. The law offices of Gregory Hayes smelled like stale coffee, expensive leather, and impending doom. I sat in the corner of the mahogany boardroom, my clothes unwashed, trying to make myself as small as possible. Across the table sat my Uncle Richard, practically vibrating with smug anticipation. My grandfather Thomas Caldwell had died 3 weeks prior. He was an eccentric man, a retired railroad engineer who spent his last decades hoarding blueprints and muttering about lost Florida history. When my parents died in a car crash when I was 16, Grandfather Thomas was the only one who checked in on me. Uncle Richard, a mid-level real estate developer with a penchant for leased sports cars and cheap suits, couldn't have cared less. But now that there was a will to read, Richard was front and center. I had been kicked out of my apartment 2 months before the reading. At 19, with only a high school diploma and a string of failed diner jobs, I was living in the back seat of my 2004 Honda Civic, parking behind strip malls and dodging security guards. "Let's get this over with, Gregory," Richard snapped, checking a fake Rolex. "I have a tea time at 2. Lawyer Hayes cleared his throat, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He read through the standard legal jargon before getting to the assets. Richard inherited the house in Orlando, the life insurance policy, and the liquid cash, a sum totaling just over $400,000. I watched Richard visibly relax, a greasy smile spreading across his face. And to my grandson, Leo Caldwell. Hayes read his voice, dropping a fraction of an octave. I leave the entirety of the St. Johns County parcel, deed number 4882-B, trusting that he alone has the vision to see what others will not. Richard burst out laughing. It wasn't a polite chuckle. It was a loud, hacking bark of pure mockery. "The swamp!" Richard gasped, wiping a tear from his eye. "He left you the worthless jungle plot." I stared at the lawyer. "What plot?" Hayes looked at me with genuine pity. "Your grandfather purchased 12 acres of uncleared land near the outskirts of St. Augustine back in 1982 at a blind tax auction. It is entirely overgrown, zoned for nothing, and completely landlocked by state conservation, scrubland on 3 sides. It is for all intents and purposes a liability." Hayes paused, sliding a thick manila envelope across the table. "Worse, Leo, there are back taxes due. You owe the county $4,200 in 6 months, or they seize it." My stomach plummeted. I had $42 to my name. I didn't inherit a future, I inherited a debt. "Tell you what, kid," Richard said, leaning over the table, smelling of peppermint and greed. "I'm a generous guy. I'll give you $500 for the deed right now. I'll take the tax hit. I can probably write it off as a loss for my firm. Take the cash. Buy yourself a hot meal and a bus ticket out of state." I looked at Richard. I looked at the smug, condescending sneer on his face. He knew I was sleeping in my car. He knew I was starving, and he was offering me scraps just to humiliate me. I thought of Grandfather Thomas, who used to tap his temple and tell me, "The world is blind, Leo. You just have to open your eyes." I grabbed the manila envelope. "I'm keeping it." Richard's smile vanished. "You're an idiot. You'll be bankrupt and in jail for tax evasion by Christmas." I walked out of the air-conditioned office and into the sweltering Florida heat. I drove my sputtering Civic 2 hours northeast, following the coordinates typed on the yellowing deed. Route 207 turned into a paved county road, which turned into a gravel path, which eventually dissolved into a deeply rutted dirt trail that wasn't on any GPS. When I finally parked the engine ticking in the oppressive humidity, I stepped out and stared at my inheritance. Richard was right. It was a green hell. A solid, impenetrable wall of kudzu poison ivy and tangled Spanish moss rose 50 feet into the air, swallowing ancient oak trees and choking the sunlight. The air was thick with the screech of cicadas and the metallic scent of standing water. There was no clearing. There was no path. The vines were as thick as my forearms, woven together like steel cables. It looked less like a forest and more like a biological fortress designed to keep people out. I sank to my knees in the dirt. I was exhausted, starving, and entirely alone. The weight of my reality crushed my chest. I had a piece of paper that said I owned 12 acres of nightmare and an eviction notice on my life. I pitched a cheap torn tent on the dusty shoulder of the dirt road right on the property line. That night, listening to the wild hogs rooting in the brush and the mosquitoes buzzing against the thin nylon of my tent, I made a choice. I couldn't sell. I couldn't run. The only way out was through. I was going to conquer this jungle, or I was going to die trying. Survival requires capital, and clearing a jungle requires tools. The next morning I drove into the nearest town and walked into a dilapidated local supply shop called Higgins Hardware. The owner, a gruff retired Marine named Dave Higgins, took one look at my scrawny, desperate frame and my plea for work. "I can't pay you much, son," Dave grunted, chewing on a toothpick. "Minimum wage, stocking shelves and unloading feed bags. But I'll let you buy tools at cost." "Deal," I said immediately. For the next month, my life became a brutal, punishing loop. From 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., I hauled bags of concrete and fertilizer for Dave. At 2:30 p.m., I returned to the plot, armed with a heavy-duty steel machete, thick leather gloves, and industrial weed killer bought with my meager wages. I attacked the green wall. It was agonizing. Florida summers are unforgiving with the humidity sitting on your chest like a wet wool blanket. I hacked at the kudzu vines, my hands blistering and bleeding inside my gloves. The vines fought back, whipping my face, tripping my boots. I encountered fire ant nests that left my calves covered in burning red welts. I had a terrifying standoff with a 5-foot eastern diamondback rattlesnake that I barely managed to chase off with a long branch. By the end of the 3rd week, I had cleared a path barely 20 feet deep and 10 feet wide. It felt hopelessly insignificant against the massive scale of the 12 acres. But I had a system now: chop, rip, drag, and burn. I built massive bonfires of dried vines on the dirt road, the smoke keeping the worst of the mosquitoes at bay. Then, during the 4th week, everything changed. I was about 40 feet into the property, hacking away at a particularly dense thicket of palmetto bushes that seemed to be growing over a strange, unnatural mound in the earth. I assumed it was a dead stump. I swung the machete hard, aiming for the root. Clang! The impact vibrated up my arm, numbing my elbow. The sound wasn't the dull thud of wood. It was the sharp, ringing resonance of metal striking solid stone. Frowning, I dropped the machete and knelt in the damp soil. I used my gloved hands to tear away the rotting leaves, the moss, and a thick layer of topsoil. My fingers brushed against something smooth, something cold. I dug faster, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. I cleared away a foot of dirt, then 2. A shape began to emerge from the earth. It was a face. I scrambled back, startled, before creeping forward again. Staring up at me from the dirt, perfectly preserved beneath a century of rot, was a beautifully carved face of white marble. It was a weeping cherub, its intricate stone curls and sorrowful eyes locked in a permanent silent cry. I sat back on my heels, wiping a mixture of sweat and dirt from my forehead. My mind spun. Why is there a classical Italian marble sculpture buried in a Florida swamp? I grabbed my machete, my exhaustion instantly replaced by an electric surge of adrenaline. I started clearing the brush around the statue with frantic energy. The vines had completely concealed the topography of the land. What I had thought were natural hills and dips in the jungle floor were actually structural. 2 feet to the right of the cherub, my blade struck stone again. I cleared the dirt. A flat rectangular paver. I dug frantically to the left. Another paver. It wasn't just a statue. It was a walkway. A perfectly laid, herringbone-patterned brick pathway buried under 6 inches of decomposing jungle matter. I followed the trajectory of the path, hacking wildly at the vines that hung from the ancient oak trees. The deeper I went, the more the natural environment felt. Wrong. The trees were massive, yes, but they were spaced too perfectly. They were planted. Days bled into a blur of feverish excavation. I stopped sleeping more than a few hours. I stopped eating anything but cheap canned beans. Dave at the hardware store noticed my bloodshot eyes and the new wild energy about me, but I kept my mouth shut. If Uncle Richard or the county found out there were historical artifacts on this land, they'd find a loophole to steal it from me before I could pay the taxes. I had exactly 5 months left. On day 42, I reached the center of the property. The canopy was so thick here that it was in a state of perpetual twilight. The brick pathway widened into what felt like a massive circular clearing, entirely choked by a mountain of thorny briars that stood 30 feet high. I spent 12 straight hours cutting through that central thicket. My arms were screaming, my clothes soaked in sweat and grime. As the sun began to set, casting long, eerie shadows through the hanging moss, I grabbed hold of a massive curtain of vines draped over a solid shape in the center of the clearing. I planted my boots, leaned back, and pulled with every ounce of strength I had left. With a sickening rip, the vines tore away, kicking up a massive cloud of ancient dust. I coughed, waving the dust away, and looked up. I dropped to my knees. Rising from the jungle floor, towering 3 stories into the canopy, was a massive structure of limestone and terracotta. Colossal, Romanesque pillars, partially crumbled, and wrapped in creeping ivy, flanked a gigantic, rusted wrought-iron double door. Above the door, etched into a grand stone archway, were words in faded Latin. Smashed stained-glass windows reflected the dying amber light of the sun. It wasn't a mosquito farm. It wasn't a swamp. Hidden in the center of the 12 acres, swallowed by time and nature, was a colossal, forgotten, Gilded Age mansion. I reached out with a trembling, bloody hand and pushed against the massive iron doors. With a deafening groan of rusted metal, the doors cracked open, exhaling a breath of cold, stale air from the darkness within. I stepped over the threshold into the palace. The air inside the mansion was heavy, tasting of dry rot and ancient dust, but it was miraculously cool. I stood in the grand foyer, my flashlight beam piercing the gloom. The beam swept across a spectacular floor of black and white checkered marble, untouched by the decay that had consumed the exterior. Above me, a massive crystal chandelier hung from a vaulted ceiling, adorned with faded frescoes of angels and ships. It was draped in thick cobwebs, looking like a ghostly galleon suspended in mid-air. I walked deeper into the belly of the beast, my boots echoing off the walls. The house was a time capsule. I passed through a formal dining room, where a long mahogany table was still set with tarnished silver plates and crystal goblets, as if the guests had simply vanished between courses. The opulent, decaying beauty of it all made the hair on my arms stand up. How had this remained hidden for over a century? On the second floor, I found my answer. At the end of a long, sweeping corridor lined with oil paintings obscured by decades of grime, there was a set of heavy oak doors reinforced with iron studs. It took me a full 10 minutes of throwing my shoulder against the wood to break the rusted lock mechanism. When I stumbled inside, the smell of old paper and leather overwhelmed me. It was a vast 2-story library. Bookshelves climbed to the ceiling, accessed by a brass rolling ladder. But my eyes were immediately drawn to the center of the room. Sitting on a massive executive desk was a heavy brass strongbox, intricately engraved. And hanging on the wall directly behind the desk, miraculously preserved away from the sunlight, was a portrait of a stern-looking man with a thick white mustache and piercing eyes. I recognized him from my high school Florida history classes. It was Henry Morrison Flagler. Flagler was the legendary oil tycoon, the partner of John D. Rockefeller, and the man who practically invented modern Florida by building the Florida East Coast Railway. My grandfather Thomas had spent 50 years driving trains on those very tracks. My hands shaking, I approached the desk. The brass strongbox was locked by a heavy iron padlock. I didn't care about preserving the lock. I took my heavy steel machete, brought it high over my head, and brought the blunt back edge down on the rusted shackle. Crack! 3 more strikes, and the lock shattered. I flipped the heavy lid open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept the moisture out for over 100 years, were stacks of documents, blueprints, and leather-bound ledgers. I pulled out the first ledger and gently opened the brittle pages. It was a diary, written in elegant looping cursive. I read the first entry dated November 14th, 1893. The panic has gripped Wall Street. The banks are failing. I cannot trust the institutions in New York. I have instructed my chief architect, John Carrere, to construct a private sanctuary in the St. John scrubland, miles from the St. Augustine coastal elite. It shall be completely off the maps, a fortress of limestone and iron. I call it the Eden Vault. Here, away from the prying eyes of the federal government and my ravenous competitors, I shall secure my true legacy. My breath hitched in my throat. This wasn't just a mansion. It was Henry Flagler's secret doomsday vault, built during the economic depression of the 1890s to hide his personal assets. Grandfather Thomas, obsessed with the railroad's history, must have discovered a missing blueprint or an anomaly in the rail lines that pointed to this very spot. He had bought the land at that blind auction in 1982, knowing exactly what was buried beneath the jungle. I dug deeper into the strongbox. Beneath the ledgers were 3 heavy velvet pouches. They clinked with a distinct heavy sound as I pulled them out. I untied the drawstrings of the first pouch and tipped it over the mahogany desk. A cascade of gold spilled out into the beam of my flashlight. They were pristine, uncirculated $20 Liberty Head double eagle gold coins dated 1890. There were dozens of them. In the second pouch, I found a collection of heavy, jewel-encrusted pocket watches stamped with the Flagler family crest, and at the very bottom of the box, in a sealed leather folder, was a stack of bearer bonds for the Standard Oil Company. I fell back into the rotting leather chair behind the desk, clutching a solid gold coin in my trembling, blistered hand. Just 24 hours ago, I was eating cold-baked beans out of a can, terrified of starving. Now I was sitting on a fortune so massive it defied comprehension. But euphoria quickly gave way to a cold, paralyzing terror. The property taxes, the $4,200 I owed to the county. I had exactly 6 days left before the deadline. If I missed the payment, the county would seize the land. And if Uncle Richard had been keeping an eye on the property, he would be the first one at the courthouse to snatch it up at the foreclosure auction. If anyone found out what was in here before I legally secured the deed, the state, the Flagler estate, or Uncle Richard would tie me up in litigation for the rest of my life. I needed to pay those taxes immediately, and I needed absolute legal armor. I shoved a handful of the gold coins and one of the pocket watches deep into my pockets, carefully packed the ledgers back into the strongbox, and ran out of the mansion. The next morning, I drove my sputtering Honda Civic all the way to Miami. I couldn't risk going to a local pawn shop in St. Augustine. Word would spread too fast. I found a high-end, discreet numismatics and antique dealer in the financial district. The dealer, an older British man named Charles Kensington, looked at my dirty clothes and unwashed hair with deep suspicion when I walked in. But the moment I laid the 1890 Liberty Head double eagles and the jeweled pocket watch on his velvet counter, his entire demeanor shifted. "My God," Kensington whispered, fixing his jeweler's loupe to his eye. "The condition. It's as if they were minted yesterday. And this watch, this bears the personal maker's mark of Tiffany and Company, commissioned specifically for the Flagler family. Boy, where did you find these? They're a family inheritance," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I need cash. Today." No questions asked and no paper trail. Kensington knew a desperate seller when he saw one, and he knew he was looking at the find of a lifetime. He offered me $85,000 in a cashier's check for 6 coins and the watch. It was likely a fraction of their true auction value, but I didn't care. It was the most money I had ever seen in my life. With the check secured, I didn't go buy a new car or a steak dinner. I went straight to the most ruthless real estate law firm in Miami. I hired Margaret Lynn, a shark of an attorney, who charged $1,000 an hour. I told her everything. I showed her the photos I'd taken of the mansion, the ledgers and the diary. Margaret's eyes went wide. "Leo, you haven't just found a house. You've discovered the holy grail of Florida history. But your uncle is going to try to take it. We need to go on the offensive." Margaret worked through the night. She paid the $4,200 back taxes directly to St. Johns County via an expedited wire transfer, completely clearing the lien on the property. Then she immediately filed an emergency injunction with the Florida Department of Historical Resources, registering the exact coordinates of the property as a protected Class A historical archaeological site under the sole ownership of Leo Caldwell. It was a good thing we moved fast, because Uncle Richard wasn't waiting for the deadline. 3 days later, I was back at my campsite on the edge of the dirt road, packing up my torn tent. The morning air was shattered by the deep, grinding roar of heavy diesel engines. I walked out to the dirt road to see a massive yellow Caterpillar bulldozer rolling up to the edge of the property line. Behind it was Uncle Richard's silver Mercedes, followed closely by a St. Johns County Sheriff's cruiser. Richard stepped out of his car wearing a tailored suit and a smirk so wide it looked painful. He walked up to me, flanked by the sheriff. "Morning, Leo," Richard called out over the idling bulldozer. "Looks like you're packing up. Good call. I told you this swamp was a liability." "What are you doing here, Richard?" I asked, crossing my arms. "I'm reclaiming the family legacy," he said smoothly. "I have a friend down at the county clerk's office. He let me know that since the property was designated as abandoned and derelict, the county approved an expedited foreclosure. The auction was this morning at 8 a.m. I bought the deed for $5,000. The sheriff is here to formally evict you. Now step aside. The dozer has to clear this useless brush so my surveyors can start mapping out the new subdivision." He had tried to steal it early. He bribed a clerk to move the foreclosure up, knowing a homeless 19-year-old wouldn't have the resources to fight back. The sheriff stepped forward, looking slightly apologetic. "Son, I have the court order right here. You need to vacate the premises." I looked at the sheriff. Then I looked at Richard. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a thick manila folder, emblazoned with the logo of Margaret Lynn's law firm. "You might want to check the timestamp on that foreclosure, Sheriff," I said, calmly handing him the folder. "Because my attorney paid the tax lien in full on Tuesday at 4 p.m. Uncle Richard bought a fraudulent foreclosure. The county will be refunding his $5,000. Richard's smirk faltered. "What, that's impossible. You don't have $4,000. You live in a garbage car." "Read the next page, Sheriff," I said, ignoring Richard entirely. The sheriff flipped the page, his eyebrows shooting up to his hairline. This is an emergency state injunction from the Department of Historical Resources. It declares this entire 12-acre parcel a protected heritage site." The sheriff looked at Richard, his expression hardening. "Mr. Caldwell, if your bulldozer touches a single blade of grass on this property, you'll be committing a federal felony." "Historical site?" Richard screamed, his face turning an ugly shade of purple. He lunged toward me, grabbing the collar of my shirt. "What did you do, you little rat?" "There's nothing in there but mud and snakes." I shoved him back hard. Richard stumbled his expensive Italian leather shoes, sinking deep into the Florida mud. "There's no swamp." "Richard," I said, my voice echoing in the humid air. I stepped aside, pointing down the long, dark tunnel I had hacked through the jungle over the last 40 days. The sunlight caught the gleam of the herringbone brick pathway, leading straight into the shadows. Grandfather Thomas wasn't crazy. He left me the keys to Henry Flagler's Eden Vault, and it belongs to me. Richard stared down the tunnel, his eyes catching the distant, imposing shape of the limestone pillars rising out of the vines. All the color drained from his face. He realized in that single moment exactly what he had mocked, what he had thrown away, and what I had endured to uncover. He collapsed against the hood of his Mercedes, clutching his chest as he hyperventilated, staring at the multi-million-dollar empire he had sold for a laugh. I didn't stick around to watch him cry. I turned my back on Uncle Richard, walked down the ancient brick path, and locked the heavy iron gates of my palace behind me. I was 19 years old. I was no longer homeless. I was the keeper of history. Can you believe the absolute checkmate Leo pulled on his greedy uncle, uncovering a lost billionaire's vault and securing a multi-million-dollar empire at 19 is the ultimate revenge story? What would you do if you found a secret room filled with gold? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If your heart was pounding during this insane historical discovery, hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe so you never miss another unbelievable true story.